Hello there, and happy Friday. This is Stacey Sanderson. And as I'm recording this, I am looking out at some of the devastation that's happened after the ice storm that we experienced last weekend here in southern central Ontario. And so we were very lucky. We have some minimal damage to our trees. We were without power, though, for 5 days. So that was an interesting experience and something that I've been writing about and will perhaps speak about. But it was my intention prior to all of the chaos that's happening to offer up a video post of a talk I gave a couple of weeks ago now. And what I felt compelled to speak about was the presence and impact of the narcissism we're experiencing in the collective. So that is both socioculturally, in addition to those who are in power, who clearly also have this pathology. And I'm going to be coming at this from two different angles. One, as a therapist, of course, and someone who speaks and writes and talks a lot about narcissism, but I'm also going to lean into my background as a crisis manager and critical incident stress debriefer, because I think that any form of debriefing is going to be really vital right now. Now, the interesting thing is when I gave this talk, I thought people would be very curious to talk about the impact of narcissism in the collective, and that's not where it went. Where it went was talking about the connections between trauma and narcissism, which is like a full circle kind of discussion. And I will touch on that a little as well in this talk. So the real purpose of this is to allow for, yes, a debriefing, but also the opportunity to build a little bit of strategies or a toolkit around how to cope with some of what we're seeing. And I also spent a good chunk of time moving through and taking in the data on this subject and the scholarly articles on the subject. And so that really also inspired this particular talk. Now, what you're going to see me doing here is I'm just going to pull up some notes since my printer just ran out of ink. It's just more chaos piling on in a week full of chaos. So, what the heck do I mean by narcissism in the collective? This is part of what has been coming up in the therapy space, but it's also underwritten by my own healing journey from being in work environments where there was what I will call narcissist interference, in quotes. In the therapy space, in people's living rooms, at the water cooler, people are being influenced by the impact of what is happening with the psyche of the world, or at the very least, how it's being presented to us. So, what do we mean by narcissism? Generally, this refers to our level of self-esteem, just to keep it simple, which exists on a continuum from healthy to pathological or disordered. Our own self-esteem develops as we individuate or become our own people, but as we individuate from our parents, our early caregivers, and as we become self and other aware and acquire that sense of separation of what our self is from our ego. So that refers to that part of us that is intrinsic or authentic, right? There are different names for this in different branches of psychology, right? But what I'm referring to here is that sense of who we are outside of our ego. And in many ways, this also refers to the development of our consciousness. So, for people who are high in narcissistic traits or who have narcissistic personality disorder, they do not fully complete this journey and cannot differentiate between themselves or their sense of self and their ego. This ego that I'm referring to is a real safety or protective mechanism for them because it protects them from shame and vulnerability. Now, we all have a little bit of this, but narcissists are not aware of it. So, the basic, sorry, as I'm moving the screen, the basic psychic structure of narcissistic personality disorder is that, again, to repeat, they lack self and other awareness. And I'll be circling back to that. They lack empathy. This is really a neurobiological deficit. So just as on a psychological level, we move through phases of child development, individuation, that's also something that's happening on a neurobiological level, what develops within the brain. These are people who are unable to self-regulate and need constant external validation to maintain ego equilibrium, narcissistic supply, whatever you want to refer to it as, and this can cause them to move through an emotional continuum of grandiosity to despair. So their sense of self is so externally referenced that their inner emotional experience is affected by that. And so you will see them, be on top of the world, or at times can even move into what looks like a depression. One of the ways that this equilibrium is disrupted is that they do not tolerate criticism well. And I need to say more about that because this isn't just overt, obvious criticism. This is perceived criticism, or if you don't 100% agree with them. All right, we're technically on number 4. Narcissists have to feel better than to be good enough. And basically, they don't have an enough button. So if you think about the Staples Easy button, this is an enough button. Whatever they have, whatever they get, whatever they receive, it is not enough. So if someone is, in an upper echelon of power, if let's just say they're the leader of the free world, as I barf to one side, that's not enough for them. Okay. They experience envy very differently than the rest of us, and they are unconsciously motivated and driven by envy. So most of us know when we feel a little bit of envy, right? We can sense it. This is not so true for people who are narcissistic. To them, it feels like someone is doing harm or something wrong to them. So they don't have that inner theory of mind or discernment to know that what is coming up for them is envy. Related to this, number 6, is they believe they are special and deserve special treatment, which of course then means they're very entitled. Number 7 is connected to number 5 and number 6. They have delusions of grandeur and idealized love. So this is a lot that I'm going to unpack. These delusions of grandeur, I think, are a dissociative or can be a level of dissociation that allows some psychological protection for them, right? So when we were all younger, we all imagined or had fantasies that we were someone very powerful, right? So I was a kid of the 70s and 80s. So, I mean, that was Wonder Woman and the Bionic Woman and Charlie's Angels and, all of these fantastic female heroines. And that isn't a delusion of grandeur, but if you're still thinking that way when you're an adult, than it can be. But these delusions really can occupy a lot of their space and time. I had someone in the office last week who was highly narcissistic, and I was watching this play out right before my very eyes. It's a shame I can't be wearing a GoPro during some of those experiences. So these delusions can feed that sense of entitlement, and it can cause a lot of inner psychic disruption if the life they're living day to day in the mundane is not living up to that delusion. The idealized love is also highly complex, and it could be its own talk, I think. But narcissists project themselves onto other people. So that means that they do have this idea of this, if you will, perfect, excuse me, love match, right? That, they are the best this and the best that, and that their love connection, that love object, to use the Freudian term, is something that they're seeking. So I am, of course, referring to this on a interrelationship level, interpersonal level, but it 100% can show up on a community level, in an international stage, on a music stage, performance stage. You can tell where I'm going off script because I get less articulate as I'm thinking about this. But this idealized love is what fills that void of their own inner love and self-awareness. So, jumping off of what I just said, number 8, they believe they're deserving of attention, accolades, and achievements that are not commensurate with their actual experience in education. Now, I wrote that, but that's really darn close to what is in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, I believe. But I think this is really important because this is the piece where I see people get triggered. So on social media, in conversation, in life, this is where I see people react and get their backs up around narcissistic behavior. Again, it's our own ego stuff coming up in these situations, right? Um, and this is, this lives on a continuum as well. But I believe an example of this right now is the trend toward dismissing and discrediting and devaluing those who do have the appropriate education and wisdom and experience to be in the upper echelons of government. That's something that really fires me up. For narcissists, number 9, relationships are transactional and they are interpersonally exploitive. So it's kind of like if I give you something, you need to give me something, or it is the unconscious way that narcissists form relationships with people that they are getting something from. They also can be interpersonally exploitive, right? So they're using you or someone else for something. So where I've seen this is in dynamics where someone is trying to make their way to a particular level within an organization. And so they may manipulate someone in order to get there. So I'm talking a little bit about ass kissing or sycophantic behavior. So again, I put these together, but they're both significant traits. But imagine that playing out on a world stage, right? Just imagine that. Number 10, narcissists lack authenticity. So what that means is, number 1, narcissists are very uncomfortable around people who are authentic. So if you are authentic, and you present that way, you have had bad experiences, excuse me, with these sorts of people. They need to copy, borrow, mirror, right? A really good example of this is how JD Vance is starting to look a little bit like Volodymyr Zelensky, and maybe I'm just like overanalyzing that, but I don't think I am. It's really interesting. So your authenticity or our authenticity really bothers them. And I've had this experience. I've settled down now, but going back a few years, before I started my private practice and certainly before COVID, I loved putting an outfit together. And I have a bit of a fashionista archetype. And so it brought me great creative joy to put together a unique outfit. And I cannot begin to tell you the flack I took from that with women in my workplace, the snide comments, the criticism, the subtle put downs, the microaggression, the dirt like that, the looks, that downward, upward swoop like that look. I guess getting older kind of helps with that as well. But this is an example of how someone's authenticity really, really pisses them off. Lastly, moving along the spectrum of narcissism to sociopathy and psychopathy, narcissists lie. And if it's not lying, it's confabulating. And lying to me is when you have a certain level of awareness that you're lying. But confabulation is when narcissists start outwardly expressing those own inner delusions that they believe to be true. So this is to just explain that a little bit better. They have their own inner reality that's very different than what the rest of us see. And then they start talking about it, right? And confabulation is also an early warning sign of dementia, where if you don't know something, you fill it in with useless information or irrelevant information. And we've all known narcissists to do that. What kind of goes with this sometimes is word salad. So when people say a lot of things and they might use flowery language, or they may try to integrate impressive vocabulary into what they're saying, but this all goes together with the confabulation. And I don't know that narcissists outright lie intentionally as much as they just they're not anchored into the truth. And maybe that's just semantics, but also many of them have a terrible memory because they're so distracted by their own inner dysregulation, right? So this is in part where gaslighting comes from to a certain extent. Sometimes they genuinely do not remember what they said or did. So it's not always a manipulation. So anecdotally, narcissists take up all the oxygen in the room, and energetically, they can be very much draining. When I had that person in my office last week, I instantly moved into a different posture. I aligned my spine and imagined a circle of light around me just to protect my energy. But narcissists really, on an energetic level, they are taking a lot of other people's energy to feed that narcissistic supply. Not to mention that they can just be rude and difficult, and even being charming can be incredibly draining. So what we want to do now is take all of this information and apply it to the world we're living in and the people who are entrusted with making these big decisions that influence all of us. Something that's interesting is the number of movies and television shows that are now centered around not just narcissists, but highly narcissistic behavior. It's becoming normalized. Excuse me, I'm sorry. We're becoming a little bit desensitized to this, right? So when I tried to go back in my mind's eye and think about, some of these miserable, self-absorbed characters, all I could come up with was Nellie Olson in Little House on the Prairie. But how many Nellie Olsons are there now, right? How desensitized to this behavior are we really becoming? Sorry for the swallow sound. This is part and parcel of how we're all experiencing narcissism in the collective, right? So we have as well a bit of a paradox. The respective fields of psychology and psychiatry at the moment do not have a cohesive, coherent diagnosis for NPD. There's a lot of discourse around it, but there's a lot of disagreement. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, still indicates that people who meet the criteria for NPD are rare at less than 1% of the population. And yet, there's an argument that these traits are so pervasive that it can no longer be labeled a disorder. This is a little scary, right? And that actually 1 in 5 people have significant narcissistic traits. So I believe the issue with this is that the criteria in the DSM is woefully out of date. I think that there are too many gender and cultural biases. And so it is fraught with issues, but there are a lot of people working to contributing to change that. But there is also a school of thought out there in academia that we are living in an epidemic of narcissism. So does this mean more people have NPD? I don't think so, but I do think it means that certain aspects of narcissistic behavior are becoming increasingly normalized. And yes, in case anyone is wondering, I do think social media has a lot to do with this. I mean, I don't know about all of you, but I can be just looking in Instagram and all of a sudden I've hit a reel and I've gone down a rabbit hole of these incredibly vain people who clearly have a very important relationship with their phone camera. So what I see is what I'm going to call echoism, like echo in the myth about Narcissus, whereby we are mislabeling narcissism. Just because someone made you feel bad, it doesn't mean that they are narcissistic, because we all can have information and thus validation at our fingertips when we Google, I think this term has been used inappropriately and unfairly. And so the reason why I'm making that point is this is what's muddying the waters, for sure. Because it seems so prevalent, and yet it's being misunderstood and mislabeled. This, of course, is a huge issue within the probably more so the family court system, but perhaps also the criminal court. But the label has been overused to the point that it's now being dismissed, which I also have a significant issue with. Now, it's important to understand narcissism in the form of patterns of power between individuals, or even patterns of power and energy. Collectively, in North America in particular, we've become nations of individuals. There is the whole self movement that's been rolling in since industrialization, that's influenced the structures of families and communities. I will also add, of course, that colonialism has caused and created much more of this as well. So as we've shifted to consumer and materialism, all of this rugged individualism, that's a lot of isms, has come at a price. And that price is our connectivity with one another and empathy for one another. You can agree or disagree with me, but in some cases, I think the global pandemic has made this much worse. In some ways, it's made us closer, but in other ways, it has created a treacherous divisiveness that has made people vulnerable to believing things that may not be true. It has created fear. It has left many people vulnerable to the influence or charm of a narcissist. So narcissists are highly opportunistic, right? If they see a problem, they believe that they are the ones who can uniquely solve it, right? Every time I say that, um, I get Eminem in my head. Now, this looks like a job for me. Eminem's song Controversy always comes into my head when I talk about that. So, when people are living in these delusions of grandeur that I spoke about earlier, they can seem incredibly compelling. And so, this can create a bit of a Munchausen's by proxy, where if someone is telling you that something is wrong, they can seem highly believable that they're the ones who can fix it. So I want to come back to talk a little bit about and look at this through the lens of consciousness. This is what we hold in our awareness. And to quote Lonnie Jarrett, it is the field of infinite proportion. I love that. In narcissism, that gets focused exclusively in the finite personal dimension of their own experience, right? Which creates this greatly overinflated sense of self. So this is consciousness, narcissistic consciousness is here. Lonnie Jarrett also says that consciousness is the fuel that can turn potential into reality, and what we focus our consciousness on, we give life to. Let's just think about that for a moment. What we focus our consciousness on, we give life to. Now, let's take all of this and apply that to someone in power. You may ask yourself, how does someone who meets the criteria for a personality disorder, how do they manage to get into the upper echelons of organizations, corporations, and government? First and foremost, more grandiose or extroverted narcissists do not tolerate being in the rank and file very well. Anyone who's ever worked with one will know this. When they're at the bottom, they can be extremely opportunistic and sycophantic. I like to say they suck up and they punch down. So they are grooming or influencing or manipulating people whom they see to be of benefit to them, but then they can treat people who in an organizational structure, in a hierarchy, they see as being less than, they will treat those people very poorly. Another phenomenon I have witnessed, but isn't widely considered as a trait of narcissist, is that they mirror. This is copying on a basic level. It is aspiring to be someone else, but it's also quite predatory in a lot of ways. So if anyone has had someone, steal their fashion sense or copy their words, it doesn't feel very good, right? And it's not, in my opinion, very complimentary. But this is the kind of unconscious behavior that we can see. So if you're the president of a country and you see someone else who's an autocrat, you may try to aspire to that if you see it as being more than what you currently have. Further to this, narcissists can thrive in environments where arrogance and competitiveness are common and even rewarded. And they unconsciously project their best and worst traits onto people, which means that they can be very difficult to get along with. It also leads to people being rather divided, right? So if a narcissist is in a workplace, one of the first clues is you get a divisiveness within that workplace, like who's with them and who's not, right? So all of that to say, they cause a lot of disruption and chaos within organizations. And I think collectively, we're all being influenced by that, right? It's become increasingly unclear who are the good guys or the bad guys. So, coming back into the research a little bit, studies indicate that those who are high in traits of narcissism become leaders, but once they get there, their performance does not live up to their hype. Is this sounding familiar? It's kind of like someone saying they're a pilot because they think they can do a pilot's job and then end up crashing the plane. So, what is the manipulation? Once narcissists are in power, they start to become terrified of losing this power. So, deep down, they're influenced by what I call the shame vulnerability vortex, right? This is energetically, this is root chakra stuff, right? This can show up as a form of paranoia, and they really can be very paranoid if they feel threatened. And I think this is where the personality pathology, I can't talk. This is where the personality pathology really tips them into mental illness territory. So, this is why someone like Putin has someone taste their food because he is fearful of being poisoned. So, if you've ever had a manager or supervisor who's highly narcissistic, you will notice that one of the things they do is target those they deem a threat. So when I was watching that infamous clip of the Trump Vance dynamic duo as they tried to publicly shame Volodymyr Zelensky, it took me right back to moments that I've experienced with the executive director human resources tag team when I was gainfully employed. Just being ganged up on to as a psychological manipulation, and I think to cause shame and discomfort. So, this fear based unconscious motivation is often what is the underlying mechanism of smear campaigns. And this is something else that's become very much normalized. So, something that 10 years ago I talked about rarely, and now it's so common, and it happens on relationships, on a relational level, organizational levels, international levels. It really, really is soul crushing that this has become so commonplace. So I said this earlier, but I'm just circling back to talk a little bit about Munchausen's by proxy. And this is connected to the idea of a smear campaign where someone invents a problem and then creates this idea that they are the only one who can solve it. So this is, this collective form of Munchausen's by proxy. I am going to make something very wrong with you so that I can be the one to fix it. People give their power away when they're afraid or if they don't feel special. And I think that dynamic is being manipulated all the time, right? In this, it is so unfair to only identify this happening in the United States because I just don't think that's true. I think they get more airtime, but I think it's happening everywhere. But I think that people, when they're afraid, they're going to align with whom they perceive as being in power, and they're going to align with that person who makes them feel special and important. I have watched this in the workplace over and over again, and I've heard about this, from clients over and over again. And I have started to refer to this as toxic belonging. So, this is where a certain subgroup of people align with a toxic leader and then malign those who may be different in order to have a sense of safety and belonging. So, this happens in families, this happens in organizations, communities, but it happens on the world stage as well. So, my intention there was to offer up the parallels between the psychological condition of narcissism, what it means to have leaders who have those issues, and then the impact on all of us. So what can we do? So what I've done is I've created an adaptation of what I recommend to people when they've been in abusive relationships or toxic workplaces or terrible church community or volunteer experiences. So I've just pulled from those many conversations and to a lesser extent my book for some of these answers. So number one, your superpower is your authenticity. Narcissistic systems can trigger old maladaptive conditioning. So it's important to stay true to yourself. Okay? Do what you love to do. Two, your second superpower is your values. These are the invisible aspects of ourselves that are so significant. Your values can be a very important orientation in all the confusion. So some of the things I'm talking about here are not obvious. These are like our power lives in what's invisible within all of us. Number three, critical thinking is key, and be very intentional with what information you're taking in. Intuition is also very important. If something feels off to you, it probably is. And so take time to really dive into and be guided by that and to connect to whatever inspires that in you. So whatever source of divinity helps you to have more access to your intuition, that wise voice inside of yourself. We all have it. Take care of your physical body. That's number five. Move, eat well and cleanly, and rest. Take time away from the digital world as much as you can. And if you are on the digital world, we all had to do that during the ice storm, right? Because it was our source of information, if you live near me. But be careful then what you're looking at, right? Be careful about the content you're taking in. Go back and read or listen to those great thinkers, writers, speakers who inspire you. These are the people who existed before influencers. These are the people who used real words and ideas, not just sound bites. Perhaps this is something that you start your day with and you let it ground and inspire you. I'm going to repeat that one. Number 7, ground yourself. So this is feeling your feet on the ground, remembering to breathe, remembering to seek that groundedness as your baseline for how you're feeling. Spend time with people who inspire and nourish you. I have on my social media someone who I used to go to high school with who basically jumps on everything I say and is defensive, and I got tired of it. And what I decided is I don't want to waste my energy on those types of interactions anymore. Align yourself with organizations and movements that are action-oriented and grassroots. Lastly, stay high vibe. Don't let the bastards get you down. Your inner peace and joy are the most powerful boundary you can have. I am deeply empathic and I can lose sleep over thinking of other people's pain. But I've learned that going into suffering with people doesn't help them. It can really overwhelm us. So that's really what empathy is. It's cultivating the awareness of that suffering and taking wise action to do something about it. Be responsive rather than reactive. So when I talk about staying high vibe, this means actively cultivating empathy as a force. It really is the best answer we have in all of this. So I wish you well. For those who live in my neck of the woods and east, west, and north of me, I hope life is returning to normal for you. It's been my experience that whenever we come through this kind of chaos that Mother Nature has provided for us, actually, she doesn't create the chaos, we do. It can be a time of great growth and transformation. So reach out, get in the conversation, like, subscribe. I always want to hear from you. If you want to work with me and talk about how to develop your own empathy and consciousness, I am 100% there for that. Take good care until we meet again.